Hi there. So today we're going to be looking at research methods in this session, and this is content that is suitable for AS paper 2 and A-level paper 2, so research methods section. For A-level, this is worth 2 sections, so 48 of your marks, whereas AS level it's worth 1 section of your paper, but obviously that can come up in other sections, even on the AS as well, in a different section. So it's really important for AS and for A-level to get to know your research methods. So I'm going to do this in sort of 2 chunks, because, or possibly 3 PowerPoints actually, because as you're probably aware, research methods is quite hefty. So this is looking at experimental design to pilot studies. So welcome to research methods, and I've just talked through quite a lot of this content here, but in psychology, we need to know how we're going to conduct our research. We need to make sure that we stay scientific and also look after the people that we are researching. So if you want to ask any questions about anything that I cover, please do so. Also really appreciate if you can like any of the videos and subscribe as well, but comments and questions are great as well. Thank you. So paper 2, this is just from the exam specification. So you should, I'm not going to read through it all because it's going to come up on the as we work through the PowerPoint anyway. And I'm sure your teachers, and you've been made aware of this from the textbook. But this is really the areas that we're going to be focusing on. So you can just pause this video if you want to have a look at this content. And then this again is just carrying on with how we carry out experiments, the types of experiments, writing an aim, hypothesis, the 2 types of hypothesis, as well as your null hypothesis, sampling, how you get hold of your participants, who they are, pilot study, what is a pilot study, and then your experimental designs and ethics. So as per my other videos, I'm just going to be going through it and explaining the points on the slides, making sense of what's on there, but obviously feel free to pause them. Feel free to, you should have a pen and paper, make notes as you're going through or add to existing notes, so that this should just really help and add to your vision. It's obviously not a full teaching tool. So when you come across a question, you might have a question asking you about the experimental method. So the experimental method is a method that we use to test our independent variable and our dependent variable. So first of all, as a researcher, you would establish an aim. This is a general statement about what you are intending to investigate. So you might be looking to investigate whether there's more bees or wasps on a hot day. Obviously, normally we're looking at human behaviour, but a nice example. And then you establish your hypothesis. So this is a more formal statement, a testable statement, which includes the independent variable and dependent variable in the context of the study. I'll come on to what your independent variable or dependent variable is on the next slide. So there are 2 types of experimental hypothesis that you need to be aware of for the A-level and the AS, and that is directional and non-directional. So they're sometimes referred to as one-tailed and two-tailed. One-tailed is the same as a directional, and that makes a prediction and would only be used if there's previous research carried out in the chosen field. So you're putting, I always say to my students, you're putting your eggs in one basket. You're saying, yep, there's definitely going to be more bees than wasps on a hot day. You would only do that if there was previous research that showed that. And then non-directional states that there will be a difference between the conditions, but you don't know fully what those differences are going to be. So there may have been a little bit of previous research, but it's not particularly well tested, not very reliable, not very valid. So, because essentially at the end of the day, you want to accept your experimental hypothesis rather than your null hypothesis. So if you go with a directional, you've got a higher chance that it may not work because you've made that prediction. So if you go with your non-directional, you state there is a difference, but you're not saying particularly what that difference will be. You've got a better chance of being able to select your experimental hypothesis effectively. So these are your 2 types of hypothesis, your directional and non-directional. So a directional here is stating condition A will do better than condition B, which is the independent variables A and B, when taking part in something that you're measuring, your dependent variable. So whenever you write out your hypothesis, always check that you've got an independent variable referred to and your dependent variable, the aspect that you're measuring. Non-directional is stating there will be a difference between condition A and condition B when taking part in set task, okay? The measurable task, that is your dependent variable. So then you have a null hypothesis, okay? So this is your alternative to an experimental hypothesis. Sorry, sometimes that's referred to. The experimental hypothesis is sometimes referred to as the alternative hypothesis, and then you also have a null hypothesis. So the research always has to write a null hypothesis. And as I mentioned earlier, this is used if the researcher doesn't work as predicted. For example, if a directional hypothesis is used and the research has an alternative result, then at the end of the researcher has to accept the null hypothesis. And it's, again, nice simple format. There will be no difference in the dependent variable measured when comparing x with y. Okay, as I've mentioned before, it doesn't matter which order you have your dependent variable and independent variables, as in your hypothesis, as long as they're all in there. Okay, so when you've written a hypothesis, be it a null hypothesis or an experimental hypothesis, just check you've got your dependent variable and your independent variables in there. Okay, and also make sure that it's operationalized. So state how you're measuring your dependent variable and what your independent variables are. So if it's memory test, it would be your dependent variable would be recall of lists of words. And so your independent variable and your dependent variable, the independent variable is the variable that is altered or changed in the experiment, and the dependent variable is the variable that is measured. So it depends on the change in the independent variable. So that's the way that I remember that. The dependent variable depends on the change of the independent variable, and you're manipulating that independent variable. Sometimes a question might refer to the levels of the IV. So when we write our hypothesis, we need to make it clear that the two conditions that are used, and this is sometimes referred to as the levels of the IV. So sometimes when we're carrying out research, we have to consider issues that may affect our results. So there are a number of factors that can affect the outcome of research. We need to consider these to control our research findings. So extraneous variables, these are additional unwanted variables that can affect the outcome of the experiment, but often can be controlled. So that might be things like the temperature of the room if you're doing a memory experiment, or the health, like today I'm not feeling 100%. People may, if they're taking part in research, might perform worse because they're feeling a bit under the weather. So just little things that could affect your results that you could control. You then have confounding variables. So these can be a little bit confused sometimes with extraneous variables, but essentially they are a type of extraneous variable. But the difference is they directly affect the outcome of the dependent variable. So as the researcher, you might think, oh yeah, I found something out about short-term memory, and you think that age impacts on short-term memory, but actually it was sleep. The people that had worse short-term memory were the ones that had a bad night's sleep. That would be a confounding variable. Something to always be aware of as well. So demand characteristics. So again, the more tightly controlled a piece of research is, so if it's in a lab, the more participants are going to act slightly differently because they know they've been invited to take part in research. So if they're just in their normal environment, in a field experiment or a natural experiment, you're going to probably have less demand characteristics. As soon as you make people aware of what's going on, you're going to have more demand characteristics. You have other issues such as investigator effects. So this is the researcher is the investigator. So this is where the researcher themselves may impact on the outcome of the results. For example, they may talk in a more friendly tone of voice to some people than to others. And this can also refer to the actions of the research that are related to the study's design. So selection of the participants, they may choose people that they think are, I don't know, slightly more attractive, or wearing clothes that they like, or the materials that they select when they write their list of words, or the clarity of the instructions. These are little things that can really impact on the research. And the way that this might be assessed in an exam is you might get asked to name one issue that can impact on the outcome of results, or a piece of research, or you might get a scenario question where they give you a scenario and then you can probably see something like this. They will drop hints in the question, pick them out. When you're reading questions in the exam, have a highlighter, have a different coloured biro, underline the key words, okay? Underline the independent variable, dependent variable as you're reading through, because that helps you with your time, because you're doing that at the same time as reading the question. And if you're working through practice papers, do that, because it's a really good habit to get into. And also, then once you've read the question and it asks you maybe like, what is the independent variable or what is the dependent variable, you've got that there already. You've read it, obviously double check yourself, but you've kind of saving a little bit of time there. Leading questions, an area of memory, can also be an example of an investigate effect. So if they're trying to investigate something, they may word their questions in a certain way. So that can be lead to some bias as well. So there are methods to improve investigator effects. So I've got a feeling randomisation might have come up in the recent paper yesterday, paper 1. It's a way to remove elements of choice from the researcher. For example, selecting words in a memory test. This can be done by a computer method to remove researcher bias. So you have your list of maybe 4,000 commonly used words, such as how Murdoch did with the serial position curve, and then you select those, put them into a computer system and get the computer system to select them. You still proof them to check that there's not lots of rhyming words or words that are linked, but it allows you to not have that researcher bias. You would also make sure that the variables are standardised, so this, or your instructions are standardised, so all participants are subject to the same environment, information and experience. This involves producing a list of information which will be used in the study, and this will include standardised instructions. So it means that your research can be repeated. So if one of my students carried out an excellent piece of research, I might think, oh yeah, I'm going to repeat that over the summer holidays. Like Ainsworth's study or Milgram's study, they carried out really excellent standardised instructions that then could be repeated. So something that students often get confused is experimental design. Okay, so it's just worth pausing on this, just noting this down. It is essentially the way the experiment is designed. So you've got 3 ways that you can do that. Independent groups, which is when you've got 2 separate groups of participants, experience 2 conditions of the experiment. So they're in condition A or condition B. They don't go into both conditions, they just experience one. So you need to know the strengths and weaknesses of each of these. And again, once you get to grips with this, it's really nice, it's really helpful because they kind of cross over. So if you know one, then you apply it to the opposite to the other one, but always link it into the question as well. So with independent groups, there's no practice effects because the participants are only experiencing one condition. They're not having to go to the second condition and have something different happen to them. And then the limitation, though, is you've got participant variables because you've got different people in both groups. So your people may act slightly differently. You might be doing a memory test and you've got lots of people that scored grade 9 in maths in one group. That's going to impact on your results. That would be a confounding variable. So an alternative to that is repeated measures. This is where participants experience both conditions of the experiment, and then both scores would be compared. So it might be that they experience condition A, then condition B, or they might all experience, say like in depression, they might all take antidepressants. So they test the same participants, their mood score beforehand, and then 6 weeks later after taking the antidepressants. So they're all experiencing taking those antidepressants. The strength of that is that you've got less participants and your participant variables are controlled, and practice effects are a limitation because the participants are experiencing both conditions. So then a sort of a nice compromise is matched pairs. This is where the participants are paired together on a variable that could affect the results. So that could be gender, weight, BMI, IQ, anything that's measurable, and then you can compare and separate them. So if it was, say, a memory test and you knew that you wanted a fair amount of sort of intelligence on both groups, you might get their GCSE scores and match the grade 9s, grade 8s, and have one grade 9 in each group, one grade 8 in each group. Or you might, if you're doing a running race, male and female comparison. You might get their BMI scores and just check that you've got the people for the different matching on their BMI score in each group. So then you've got a fair sort of comparison. And the strength of this is it's removing the issue of participant variables because you've selected one participant variable to focus upon, and also practice effects because they're not in both conditions. But it is really time consuming, and although you might control one aspect of the participant variables, there are other participant variables that can also become an issue. So another alternative to matched pairs is known as counterbalancing. And this is a useful method to help with practice effects in repeated measures. So it's still using repeated measures. So you could get a question showing you an example of a repeated measure design, and then say, oh, the researcher used counterbalancing. Why did they use counterbalancing? Or how did they conduct counterbalancing? And essentially what you do, you get all of your participants, all group of them, split them in two, and then half of them go to condition A and experience that condition. The other half go to condition B, and then they swap. Okay, so this balances out the practice effects. So they're all split in half. Half go to condition A and experience that, and then go to condition B, and half go to condition B, and then go to condition A. So that's why it's balancing, counterbalancing, because it's sort of removing the practice effects. Because although there is practice effects, because they all experience both conditions, half of them are experiencing the practice effects sort of secondary. So it balances it out nicely. So you need to know your types of experiment. So a type of experiment is different to your experimental design. So you've got 4 types of experiment: your lab experiment, laboratory experiment, highly controlled conditions. And the way that I try to think of it is that the participants are invited into a controlled environment to take part in the experiment, because sometimes students can get mixed up and think that it has to be carried out in a lab or a formal setting, and it actually could be a church hall, or it could be a it's still a controlled setting, but it is somewhere like a classroom, a conference room, just anywhere that they can have a sort of control the conditions. And so, yeah, that means that they control the IV and measure the DV effectively. But then obviously it increases demand characteristics because the people have been invited into that environment. So then an alternative is a field experiment. So you still have a controlled IV and a measured DV, but in the person's normal environment. So it might be that you set up an experiment in a playground for children, or in a coffee shop, and you have somebody drop a tray. So that would be your IV, and then you're intending to measure the age of the people that help that person after they've dropped their tray. So that would be your DV. And obviously the issue with that is there's a couple of issues, because you've got informed consent, because people don't know they're taking part in research, and also you've got other confounding variables can occur. And then you've also an alternative to that, or a further sort of more natural example, is natural experiments. So this is, you still have an IV and a DV, but it's occurring anyway. So I think of it like researchers are piggybacking on a natural manipulation of an IV and a DV. So an example that I often use with my students is during COVID. It's a really good opportunity for researchers to investigate the impact of young children not socialising on speech development. So by doing that, they've the researchers are able to investigate the implication of staying at home and the implication of that on speech development in young children. So that happened. You couldn't set that up. It'd be completely unethical, locking people up in their homes for all but 1 hour a day, not being able to go to school, etc. But that happened, so the researchers can use that to kind of conduct the impact of that. And then a type of natural experiment, could even be a lab experiment or a field experiment, is a quasi-experiment. Again, it sounds complicated, but it's not. It's just a natural experiment, but based on an existing difference between people. So gender. if you were comparing male and females running ability, that would be a quasi-experiment, because you can't go around swapping people to gender, swapping their genders, obviously, for the purpose of research. So that would be a quasi-experiment. Even just comparing people with OCD and their effect on traveling on a plane, if that's what you're interested in. You either have OCD or you don't, or you have a diagnosis of OCD or you don't. So you don't go around allocating people, then, all right, you have OCD, go into that group. Here's OCD, like you can't, they have OCD or they don't. So those are your examples of the types of experiments. So you do need to know your strengths and limitations of the experiments, and I've obviously spent a bit of time here pulling this together for you. So with a lab experiment, you've got high control over your confounding and extraneous variables, because obviously you've set it up and therefore it's easy to replicate. But it may lack generalizability due to the fact it is in a lab setting, so there's more demand characteristics. So keep referring to these terms. When you're answering your questions, use these terms. If it was a scenario question, so where they've given an example of somebody conducting research, say there's more demand characteristics because the people have been invited to take part in a memory test or whatever it is they've put into that question. Field experiment, higher mundane realism because the environment is more natural. I always think it's a bit of a funny double negative, but it means that it's more realistic. Loss of control of your confounding variables and extraneous variables, because obviously you're in a normal environment, so you can't control how people are behaving and who's necessarily there. And so replication is not always possible, because you might get one results one day and then slightly different results a different day. Natural experiment, a strength is that the research can be carried out, so that can't be set up. So, for example, the Romanian orphans, that couldn't have been obviously set up because of the ethics of that, removing children from their families and treating them in the way that they were treated. But we can use it as research, obviously with consent and protecting the participants. But obviously, most of the natural experiment research, there are unique circumstances, so therefore it's difficult to generalise, and other variables can affect the outcomes. Quasi can be carried out in controlled conditions, and therefore it's good, so it's high control over the other variables, it's easy to replicate, as long as your conditions are quite easy. But you can't randomly allocate participants to their conditions, so you might have other sort of confounding variables and extraneous variables there. Sorry, that's cut off a little bit. So when you're carrying out your research, you've obviously got to get hold of your population, the people that you are studying. So the population is like your overall people that you're going to be investigating, and that's often referred to as the target population. So if you are studying people with dementia, your target population is people with dementia. If you're studying the impact of starting sixth form in year 12, your target population is year 12. But obviously you can't get hold of all of those people. So you have to access a representation of those, and that's what the sampling method or the sampling frame is. So these are your ways of how you get hold of your participants. There's 5 ways that you will be able to, you can use to access your participants, and sometimes there's only one method you can use, or sometimes you might have a choice, so you have to think about the strengths and weaknesses of each one. So random sampling, all members of the target population have an equal chance of being selected. And again, similar to when we looked at a randomization earlier on, sometimes you get a question that might ask you, a researcher has used random sampling, how did they get hold of their participants? So you could talk through this process. So all members of the target population are issued with a number, then all of the numbers are placed in a number generator or a hat and selected. The reason this came up in a question before, it has to be a number rather than the name, because if you were doing it in a hat, you could still get researcher bias, because obviously the people who are picking the names out might think, oh yeah, that's my friend, so therefore select people that they know, whereas if it's a number, they're not going to know those people. Systematic sampling, so people often get systematic and stratified mixed up. So systematic is following a system, so every nth member of a target population is selected, so that would be every 5th person, every 3rd person, etc., depending on how many people you've got in your sampling frame, and how many people you want to conduct your research with. So to do that, you would gain a sampling frame, so you might get a list of every name, house in a particular road or postcode, and then select every 5th name. And then the next one is a stratified sample. This is where you make up a sample which reflects the proportions of people in certain subgroups. So first of all, you identify the subgroup in your target population, so it can be gender, and then you select a proportionate amount of each group. Okay, so for example, if you were looking in a sixth form and you had more boys than girls in that sixth form, maybe it's 60-40, and you're going to use 10 people for your sample, then you would have 6 boys and 4 girls. Or if you're going to use 20 people, you would have 12 boys and 8 girls. So it's like a representation of your subgroups, and that could be religions, obviously gender, it could be ethnic groups, so depending age categories, so any sort of subgroup, then you can do that, and obviously that's unique to certain types of research. So these two are your probably slightly easier types of sampling methods. So opportunity, this is a method of obtaining people who are available and ready to take part in the research. So you might access people who are in a sixth form common room at lunchtime, and you approach them and ask if they're available to take part and happy to take part in your research. The alternative is a volunteer, so just slight difference between these two. So the participants self-select themselves to become part of the research. So I always think of it like you'd put up a poster in a sixth form, and on there you say, would you like to take part in some research? Contact me here, phone this number. Or you might send out an email and the people volunteer themselves to take part in that research. So as with all of our types of experiments, experimental designs, we need to know our strengths and weaknesses of each method. So for random, it can be more unbiased, as everyone in the target population has an equal chance of being selected. So there's no researcher bias there's no participant bias, it's just an equal chance of everyone being selected. But it still can be time consuming because you've got to obtain a full list of your target population, and then you still may end up with a biased sample, because the nature of that technique is that you still might get all the people that live near each other on a road, because everyone's got an equal chance of being selected. Systematic, again, this is objective. There's no researcher selective. That's where you've got every 5th person, every etc. But it can be time consuming, and participants may still then refuse to take part. You can't force them just because they've been selected. So then you've got to go back to the drawing board. Same with stratified, it's a representative sample which reflects the makeup of the population, and it makes that generalisation more possible, but it's not always perfect. So there's still, you've broken up one range of strata, so for example gender, but you still might get some bias on ethnic group or age, which then you can't break that down as well because it gets way too complicated. And then opportunity, so it's very convenient and probably one of the most common methods, and very sort of least costly. Anything that involves time usually comes with the impact of money as well, but don't just write time and money, you need to explain why for a researcher, but it can still be biased, because if you went into a sixth form common room at lunchtime, you may get a slightly different person on a Monday lunchtime to a Friday lunchtime, or depending on the time of day or the time of the week. So you have to be very careful about how you select your participants and time of day, or where you're getting them from. Same with volunteer in terms of strength. Again, it's good because it requires minimal impact, because the people are coming to you. You just need to put your advert up. But often you get a certain sort of type of person who's quite keen, who opt to take part, and they may be more enthusiastic than the ordinary population. So again, you're not getting a a realistic sort of representation. So the next area that we're looking at is ethical issues and the way that we're dealing with them. So we've got 4 ethical issues that we need to think about, which are informed consent, deception, protection from harm, privacy and confidentiality. So this is just giving you an explanation and kind of a ways to deal with them, because each part could get asked in your in an exam. So informed consent involves making your participants aware of the aims of the research, plus their rights when taking part and what their data will be used for. So this means deliberately sort of making sure that they've got some information about it. Now you can be a little bit careful. You can sometimes hold a little bit of information back, as long as you're not going to put your participants any harm when you're carrying out your research. So with informed consent, the way that you deal with it, if you give your participants a consent letter telling them what they're taking part in, again an overview, and then you can give them a full debrief at the end. And if it's somebody under the age of 16, you have to give that information or that consent from a parent or guardian. So that's worth just noting down. Deception, this means deliberately misleading or withholding information from your participants. So again, we have to be a little bit, we can be a little bit clever about this. If we're not going to harm our participants, then we can hold a little bit of information back, because obviously if we give them too much, we're going to impact on our results. So we just need to be a little bit careful there. So the way that we do this is that we might give them a full overview of what they've been taking part in afterwards, and that's called a full debrief. And so you might give them an email or just a slip of paper with that information, and obviously you can do that with a field study, because obviously they've taken part in something and they didn't even know it. So tell them what you're using their data for, and if they're like, oh, I really don't want you to do that, they've got the right to withdraw their data and their name and their information. They have to have the protection from harm. So if they're putting it under any psychological harm or physical harm, so even with like a memory test, they might find out that their memory's not very good, they might have dementia in their family, it might cause them quite a lot of harm. So you would offer counselling or support if they did find out something about themselves. So you'd give them what we call signposting to other areas to help them if they found something about themselves. And then they also have privacy and confidentiality, so the right to control information about themselves. This is the right of privacy. And then confidentiality is the right in law to have any personal data protected. So if you were using information about participants, they ideally, you don't need to use their names. We don't collect names. It's better. We don't really need names in research. It would possibly be ages. If we did use names, we'd have initials, so like with HM, he was referred to as HM, KF, and so we just make sure that those participants are aware of that, and then they remind the participants during their briefing and debriefing that they've got that right to withdraw and control their own information. Okay, so this is the last little bit on this first PowerPoint for research methods. Okay, so 33 minutes at the moment. I will be doing another one over the weekend, ready for your AS paper 1 on Monday. But obviously, as you can see, research methods is a big old topic. So I'm just going to finish off with this section. So we've got pilot studies, and that's basically just a trial run of the experiment to test that everything you set up is going to work when you run it with a larger group of people. You could also do a pilot study with a questionnaire or an interview, because often when you're closely involved with research, you get quite biased or quite involved in the questions, and actually you run your questions out and they don't make sense to the people, so you can then amend them slightly. So a pilot study is a small scale trial run of the investigation, and therefore it's useful in experiments, observations and questionnaires or interviews. In observation studies, it allows the research to try out coding and systems prior to the real investigation. So coding are the different methods that you would use when you're observing people and sort of taking down their categories of behaviour, and that's going to be looked at in my next set of slides. And then another way of avoiding any sort of bias, researcher bias, 2 methods: single blind procedure. So this is where the sort of more common way, where the participants are not told which condition they're in. Obviously, why would you tell them? You don't need to tell your participants. And then a double-blind procedure. This is where the researchers and the participants don't know which group is which. Obviously, practical reasons, that can be a little bit difficult for the researchers, so it's less common. Might be if you were taking part in running out like a new medication, the researcher who's issuing out the medication doesn't know if they're issuing the placebo or the antidepressant or whatever it is that they are trialling. So it can be quite common, but obviously things like, I don't know, CBT or a memory test, you're going to be carrying out that research, so you're going to probably be aware of that. But it obviously removes any bias there, because if possible, because if the researcher doesn't know, they're not going to be sort of wording things in a certain way or having a tone of voice that can affect the way they talk to their participants. Okay, so that's the last little bit of this first research methods slide. So if you can like and subscribe, and then I'm hoping to get the next set. I think it will be in 3 sections. I'm hoping to get that done over the weekend, but it is a big old task. So good luck with your revision, and I'll see you again over the weekend.